11:57 p.m. The last of the rain had started 20 minutes ago, coming down in thin, cold needles against the corrugated roof of a small garage on the outskirts of Millfield. David Calloway wiped his hands on a shop rag, checked the deadbolt out of habit, and reached for the light switch. The day was done. The invoices were filed, the floor was swept, and the only sound left in the world was the slow drip of water from a gutter that had needed replacing for 2 winters now. He was about to turn off the last overhead lamp when the knock came sharp, fast, and completely wrong for the hour. He stood still for a moment, telling himself it was probably Jake from 2 blocks over, locked out again, or maybe a stranger with a flat tire looking for someone awake. He crossed the floor, unlocked the side door, and pulled it open. The woman standing in the rain was not Jake from 2 blocks over. She was not anyone David could have reasonably expected. She was wearing a charcoal gray suit jacket and tailored trousers that together cost more than the transmission job he had finished that afternoon, and her dark hair was plastered flat against her face from the rain, and she was looking at him with an expression he had never once seen on her face in the 3 years he had worked beside her. She looked uncertain. She looked like she needed something, and David, whose chest had gone cold the instant he recognized her, said absolutely nothing for a very long time. "En vous annoyez," she said, then caught herself, slipping into English the way she always had when she wanted to sound controlled. "What did you just say?" And David, who had not said a single word yet, simply stared. Victoria Hart, the most powerful CEO in the city. The woman who had signed his termination papers in front of 230 employees on a Tuesday morning 3 years ago, without so much as looking him in the eye. She was standing in the rain outside his garage, and she was asking him what he had said. He had not said anything, but he was about to. David Calloway was 42 years old, and most people in Millfield knew him as the quiet mechanic on Hargrove Lane, who charged a fair price and never oversold a repair. He had owned the garage for 2 years, long enough for the regulars to start calling it Dave's place, even though the sign out front still read Calloway Auto. He lived alone in the apartment above the shop, 3 rooms, a view of the parking lot, and a coffee maker that took 12 minutes to brew a single pot because he had never gotten around to buying a better one. He was not unhappy. He was not bitter. He had simply become, in a very deliberate and methodical way, a man who lived inside the width of his own days and did not reach beyond them. But he had not always been that man. There was a version of David Calloway that had existed before the garage, before Millfield, before the deliberate smallness, a version who wore a pressed shirt to work every morning and sat in glass-walled conference rooms and understood, with quiet confidence, exactly how large organizations moved and what it took to keep them moving. For nearly a decade, David had been the chief operating officer of Hart Industries, one of the fastest-growing logistics and supply chain conglomerates on the East Coast. He had built the operational infrastructure of that company from a mid-size regional distributor into a $2 billion enterprise. He had hired good people, protected them from bad decisions made above his pay grade, and driven results that made shareholders grateful and competitors nervous. He had believed, without arrogance, that he was good at what he did, and he had believed, without quite enough caution, that the people above him recognized that. Victoria Hart had been 36 when she took the CEO chair, inheriting a company from a father who had spent the last years of his life slowly losing his grip on it. She was sharp, composed, and utterly terrifying in a negotiation, and David had respected her from the first board meeting he had attended under her leadership. They had worked well together. Not warmly, Victoria did not do warmth. Or at least she had never shown any to him, but with the clean, mutual respect of 2 people who understood what they were each there to do. He had thought that counted for something. He had been wrong. 3 years ago, in the space of a single morning, everything David had built inside that company had been stripped from him. A $7 million discrepancy had been discovered in the operational accounts. The internal audit had pointed to him. Victoria had called the all-staff meeting herself, and she had read his termination notice aloud in a room full of people who had been his colleagues, some of them his friends, and she had done it with the same level of affect she used to announce quarterly earnings. He had tried to defend himself. He had asked for a full investigation. He had been told the investigation was complete. He had been walked to the lobby by security, actual security, with badges and earpieces, as though he were a threat, and his access card had been cut before the elevator reached the ground floor. He spent the next 4 months trying to find someone in the legal system who believed him, and the next 8 months accepting that the money and the institutional authority arrayed against him were going to win. He had burned through his savings, lost the apartment in the city, and eventually driven south with everything he owned in the back of a 10-year-old pickup truck, looking for somewhere cheap enough and quiet enough to start over. Millfield had been an accident, a blown radiator hose on the interstate that had deposited him at a local shop, and the owner, an old man named George Pryor, had offered him work while the part was being ordered. And something about the smell of the place, the grease and the metal, and the simple honesty of a broken thing being made to run again, had kept him there. George had retired 18 months later and sold David the lease for less than it was worth, and that had been that. He had not thought about Hart Industries in a long time. He had a photograph somewhere, a company off-site from 5 years ago, 20 people standing in front of a rented conference center upstate, everyone squinting against the sun. He had come across it once while looking for his passport and had looked at it for a long time, at the faces of people he had genuinely liked, at his own younger face in the back row, and then he had put it back in the box and not looked for it again. The last thought he'd had before the knock at the door that night was something small and private. At least he would never have to see her again. Victoria Hart had been on the cover of Business Quarterly 3 times in 5 years. The most recent issue had called her a defining voice of American enterprise leadership and featured a photograph of her in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling glass, looking out over a city skyline, with the particular expression of someone who has already decided what the city will look like in 10 years. The profile inside described her as decisive, visionary, and incapable of sentimentality. The journalist had meant it as a compliment. Victoria had read it over breakfast and thought, not for the first time, that the people who wrote about her had no idea who she actually was. Hart Industries, as of the last 3 months, was in serious trouble. It had nothing to do with the market and everything to do with the board. The men who sat on the Hart Industries board of directors were older, mostly, and almost uniformly suspicious of the direction Victoria had taken the company, the technology investments, the restructuring of the distribution network, the insistence on long-term returns over short-term extraction. They had been tolerating her for 3 years, and their tolerance had run out. 2 of them had begun making quiet overtures to a private equity firm based in Chicago that was very interested in acquiring Hart Industries at a price that would reward shareholders handsomely and reduce the company to a stripped asset within 36 months. Victoria had known about the overtures for 6 weeks. She had spent those 6 weeks trying to find a way to stop it, and she had not slept more than 4 hours a night in any of them. But the thing that had driven her out of her office on a rainy Tuesday night, the thing that had put her behind the wheel of her car with no destination in her GPS and a cold knot of nausea in her chest, was not the board. It was the report. 3 weeks ago, a compliance officer named Sandra Reeves, careful, methodical, newly promoted from the audit team, had flagged an anomaly in a set of archived financial records from 3 years prior. She had brought it to Victoria quietly, in person, and had laid a folder on her desk and said nothing while Victoria read it. The folder contained the results of a secondary review of the original audit that had led to David Calloway's termination. Sandra had found emails, internal communications between the then Vice President of Finance, a man named Richard Marsh, and 2 external consultants that had been deliberately excluded from the original investigation file. The emails documented, in terms that left very little room for interpretation, an effort to redirect the auditor's attention toward the operational accounts and away from a set of structured transactions that Marsh himself had authorized. The $7 million discrepancy had not originated in David's department. It had been manufactured in Marsh's and then buried under David's name. Richard Marsh had retired 14 months ago with a generous package and a letter of commendation signed by Victoria herself. The man who had been publicly accused, professionally destroyed, and quietly erased from the company's institutional memory had been innocent. Victoria had sat at her desk for a very long time after Sandra left. and she had felt something she rarely allowed herself, not guilt, exactly, though guilt was part of it, but a kind of reckoning that goes deeper than guilt, the kind that happens when you look back at a decision you thought you made from principle and realize you made it because it was easy, because the evidence was in front of you, and the board was watching, and firing someone quickly was what decisive leaders did, and you had wanted, more than anything, to look decisive. She had not cried. She was not sure she still knew how. But she had sat there for a long time. And then she had gotten in her car. And she had driven. She had found the address through a background research service she used for due diligence on business partners. It had taken 11 minutes. David Calloway, formerly of Hart Industries, now operating a sole proprietorship automotive repair shop at 44 Hargrove Lane, Millfield. She had sat in the parking lot for 6 minutes before she got out of the car. She had not planned what she was going to say. That was the most honest thing about the whole evening. She had not planned a single word of it. The garage smelled like motor oil and cold rain and something faintly metallic, and Victoria stood just inside the doorway, while David stood 8 feet away with his arms at his sides, and his expression absolutely unreadable. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a long time. Outside, the rain picked up again, drumming against the roof in a low, continuous murmur. Finally, David reached past her and pushed the door closed, not rudely, just efficiently, because the rain was coming in across the floor. He did not offer her a chair. He did not offer her anything. "You know where I am," he said, "so I'm going to assume you didn't get lost." Victoria had been in boardrooms where CEOs twice her age had tried to unnerve her and failed. She had negotiated contracts with men who used silence and contempt as weapons, and had matched them without effort. She had no idea why standing in this garage, in front of this man she had not spoken to in 3 years, made her feel like she was 19 again and entirely unsure of herself. She straightened anyway, the way she always did when she was uncertain, spine up, chin level, and said, "I have something I need to tell you. And I need you to let me finish before you say anything." David's expression did not change. "You can say what you came to say," he told her. "I'm not going to stop you." She started to speak. She told him about Sandra Reeves and the flagged report. She told him about Richard Marsh and the emails. She told him what the evidence showed about where the money had actually gone and how the original audit had been shaped to point in his direction. She told him clearly, and without softening it, the way she would have delivered any other finding of fact, except that her voice was doing something she could not entirely control, a slight unevenness in it, as though the sentences were harder to say than she had expected. David listened. He did not move. He did not speak. He just stood there in the center of his garage and listened to her dismantle the event that had destroyed 3 years of his life. And when she finished, the silence between them was the loudest thing in the room. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. And she could tell from the way his jaw tightened that he knew she meant it, and she could also tell that it was not enough, not nearly enough, and she did not blame him for that. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, in a voice that was quiet and flat and entirely controlled, "People like you only remember other people when you need something from them." He had not meant to say it. He was not certain where it came from, some back room of exhaustion and old anger that the last 3 years had filled up and never emptied. But it came out, clear and whole, and the moment it did, something shifted in the air of the garage. Victoria went very still. Her expression did something complicated that David could not fully read, and she looked at him the way you look at something that has just told you an exact and specific truth about yourself. Then she said, quietly, "What did you just say?" David frowned. He had meant it. He was not going to apologize for it. "I said you should leave," he told her. Because she was still standing there, and he did not know what else to do. "That's not what you said," she said. The sentence before that, he looked at her, confused by the intensity in her voice. "I said people like you only remember other people when you need something from them." Victoria Hart did not look away. She did not move toward the door. She just stood there in her soaked suit in a garage in Millfield, and something behind her eyes was working very hard at something David couldn't name. "Say that again," she said, almost to herself, and everything between them changed. She had given him the folder before she left that night. It was the same folder Sandra Reeves had laid on her desk, thick with printed emails and transaction records, and a signed affidavit from one of the external consultants who, facing a separate securities investigation, had decided cooperation was in his best interest. Victoria had held it out to him without preamble, and David had not taken it immediately, had looked at it first, the way you look at something you're not sure you want to touch, because touching it makes it real, and real things have consequences. Then, he took it. "Read it," she told him, "then hate me if you still need to." He waited until her car was gone, and the sound of the rain had settled back to its normal register, before he sat down at his workbench and opened the folder. He read it slowly. He was not a man who rushed through things, and the documents deserved the kind of attention that rushing would have cheated. The emails between Richard Marsh and the external consultants were detailed and deliberate. There was nothing ambiguous about them, no room to read them as innocent coordination. They were the communications of people who had decided what the outcome of the investigation needed to be before the investigation began, and who had done the work of ensuring that outcome with the calm efficiency of people who believed they would never be caught. David read through each of them twice. Then he went back and read the original audit summary, which Sandra Reeves had included for comparison, and he traced the way the findings had been shaped, how certain transactions had been described with language that made them appear to originate from his department when the underlying authorization trail went somewhere else entirely, how certain communications from his own files had been stripped of context in ways that made them damning rather than ordinary. He had known, 3 years ago, that the evidence against him was wrong. He had known it the way you know things that are simply true, not from proof but from the bedrock certainty of your own memory, your own actions, your own understanding of what you had and hadn't done. But knowing something is wrong and being able to demonstrate that it is wrong are not the same thing. And he had spent 14 months trying to bridge that gap and failing. And after a while he had stopped trying. He had told himself it was because the fight was unwinnable. And that was true. But there was something else underneath that. Something he had never quite examined directly. He had begun, somewhere in the exhaustion of it, to doubt himself. Not about the money, he had never doubted that. But about his judgment. About whether he had been naive or careless, or whether there had been signs he should have seen and hadn't. He had carried that doubt into the garage and into the apartment above it, and into every morning since. Now he sat with the folder open in front of him and felt something he had not felt in a long time, something sharp and specific and not entirely comfortable. He had been right. He had been right all along, and no one had told him. He closed the folder at 1:30 in the morning and sat in the empty garage for a while, listening to the rain. He was not sure what he felt. He had expected rage, if he was honest, the clean, satisfying kind of rage that comes with vindication. Instead, there was something more complicated, something that mixed relief with grief, and grief with anger, and anger with a question he wasn't ready to answer, which was, what did he do with this now? David closed the folder at 1:30 in the morning. Then he looked at the wall, where a calendar from 3 years ago was still pinned. He had never taken it down, some stubborn refusal to concede the significance of that year. And he thought about the fact that Victoria Hart had driven in the rain to a garage in Millfield, and stood in the water coming under his door, and said, "I'm sorry," a voice that cost her something. He wasn't ready to answer any of the larger questions yet, but he picked up his phone, found a note he had started, and never sent 3 years ago, a list of names, colleagues, people he had trusted, who had turned away from him, and he stared at it for a long moment. Then he set the phone face down and went to bed. There were things Victoria had never told anyone about the years before she became the woman on the magazine cover. She was 29 when her father called her into his office and told her, with the particular awkwardness of a man who loves his daughter but has never learned how to show it directly, that the board had approved her appointment as CEO. She was the youngest chief executive in the company's history, and she was inheriting a firm that was functional but fragile, with a board of directors who had tolerated her father for decades and were prepared to tolerate her only to the extent that she did not disrupt the arrangements they had grown comfortable with. She had walked into her first board meeting knowing that 6 of the 8 men in the room believed she was a placeholder. She had spent the next 2 years proving they were wrong, and the method she had used was simple and entirely effective. She never showed them anything they could use. No hesitation. No softness. No sign that she was uncertain about anything she decided. Uncertainty, she had learned quickly, was the thing they were watching for, the crack in the facade that would give them permission to question her authority. She had sealed every crack she could find. She had become, over time, very good at it. So good that she was no longer entirely sure where the performance ended and the person began. The afternoon of David's termination was not something she had forgotten. She had thought about it more than she had told anyone, including herself. At the time, she had done what the situation seemed to require. The audit had found irregularities. They pointed to the COO's department. The board was watching. And moving quickly was what you did. She had signed the papers and called the meeting and stood at the front of the room and read the notice aloud, and she had done it with the expression of someone who is entirely certain. Because she had been, she told herself, entirely certain. The evidence was in the report. The report had been prepared by professionals. She was a decisive leader, and this was a decisive decision. She had not let herself sit with the fact that something about it had felt wrong, that David's face, when she had finally looked at it as she finished reading, had not been the face of a guilty man being caught, but the face of someone who genuinely could not understand what was happening to him. She had filed that observation under "not my concern" and moved on. "The day I signed those termination papers," she told David. When she came back the following evening with coffee from the all-night diner 2 miles away, and he let her in without comment, was the day I hated myself the most. Not because I thought I was wrong at the time. Because I didn't let myself think about whether I was right. She was sitting on an overturned crate near his workbench, her jacket draped over a car hood, and she looked, in that moment, like someone who had not slept in a number of days. David sat across from her on a shop stool, his hands wrapped around his own cup, watching her with the careful attention he gave to things he was not yet sure he trusted. "The board wanted it done fast," she continued. "So I did it fast. And I told myself that was leadership. It wasn't leadership. It was convenience, dressed up as conviction." She looked at him directly. "I should have given you more time. I should have asked more questions. I didn't." David did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Were you afraid of them?" Victoria considered the question seriously, the way she considered things she had not been asked before. "Yes," she said. "I don't think I knew it at the time. But yes, it was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in years." She could feel, as she said it, the particular discomfort of a person who has been armored for a long time and has just taken a small piece of the armor off. David was still watching her, not with hostility now, and not yet with warmth, but with the particular attention of someone who is measuring the distance between what a person says and what a person is, and doing the calculation carefully. "There's something else," he said. Not a question, a statement that suggested he already suspected there was more. Victoria set her coffee down on the workbench. "Yes," she said. "There is." Hart Industries was 11 weeks away from a board vote that would almost certainly approve the sale to the Chicago firm. The private equity group, a company called Meridian Capital Partners, had offered a price that rewarded the shareholders and would provide the board members with exit packages that insulated them from any lingering accountability for the company's current condition. It was a clean outcome for everyone except the 2,400 employees who worked for Hart Industries, and who would, within 24 to 36 months of the acquisition, be looking at a substantially smaller, restructured operation, with significantly fewer of their jobs still intact. Victoria had spent 6 weeks building a counter-proposal, a restructuring plan that would address the board's concerns about profitability without surrendering the company to extraction, a plan that required a level of operational precision that she could deliver strategically but not technically, because the operational architecture of Hart Industries had been rebuilt by David Calloway, and the man who had succeeded him had never fully understood it, and the man after that had not done much better. The only person who understood the operational infrastructure of that company deeply enough to execute a restructuring of the kind the counterproposal required was the man sitting across from her in a garage in Millfield. David listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The coffee had gone cold, and neither of them had noticed. Outside, the night had settled into a still, windless dark, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the building. "You came here to apologize," he said finally, "but you also came here because you need me." Victoria did not look away. "Yes," she said. David stood up, turned away from her, and walked to the window that looked out over the parking lot. She watched his back and waited. "I'm not a lifeboat," he said, and there was an edge in it, not cruelty, but the edge of a man who has spent 3 years rebuilding something and is very clear about the terms on which he is willing to be known. "I know," Victoria said. "I know you're not, and I'm not asking you to be. I'm telling you the full truth of why I'm here, and I'm leaving the decision entirely to you." He turned back around. His expression had shifted, not softened, but become more complex, the way a face becomes when it's holding more than one thing at once. "Get out of here," he said. "Let me think." She left. He stood in the empty garage for a long time, and then he turned off the light and went upstairs and did not sleep. He spent 3 days thinking. He drove the truck out to the reservoir on Thursday morning, which was something he did when he needed to think without any noise around him, and he sat on the hood watching the flat gray water and asking himself the question he had been avoiding since Tuesday night. The question was not whether he believed Victoria's account of Marsh's scheme. He did, entirely, and the folder had closed that particular debate. The emails were not ambiguous, and the consultant's affidavit was not the work of someone improvising it, was the documented account of a person who had been part of something and had finally decided that distance from it was more important than loyalty to it. Richard Marsh had been careful and patient and thorough, and none of that changed the fact that he had built his careful, patient, thorough plan on the back of a man who had done nothing to deserve it. David had known that 3 years ago. He knew it with considerably more documentation now, and the knowing was clarifying in a way that was also, unexpectedly, exhausting the way it is exhausting when you have been carrying something heavy for a long time, and someone finally acknowledges the weight, because acknowledgement makes you feel it all over again, makes you understand how much of your energy has gone into the carrying. The question was not whether Hart Industries deserved to survive, that was above his moral pay grade, and he had decided a long time ago not to carry things that weren't his to carry. The question was whether going back into that world, on any terms, would cost him the thing he had most carefully rebuilt in the last 3 years, which was not the garage or the income or the modest life in Millfield. It was the knowledge of his own worth, the certainty, earned slowly and without external confirmation, that he was a capable and principled man, who had been wronged and who had gotten back up. That knowledge was the thing he had protected most fiercely, and the thing he was most afraid of losing, because he was not sure, if he lost it again, that he would be able to rebuild it a second time. He talked to some people. Not about Victoria or Hart Industries. Just conversations, the kind you have with people who have known you for a while and whose judgment you trust. He had coffee with a retired contractor named Carl who had been one of his first regular customers and had become, in the gradual way these things happen, something close to a friend. Carl was in his late 60s, had built and sold 2 small businesses, and had the particular quality of someone who listens more than he speaks and does not offer opinions he hasn't earned. They sat at the counter of the diner down the road and talked about the Mustang restoration and a plumbing job Carl was doing on his back porch. And at some point, David said, without preamble, "Have you ever gone back to something you walked away from?" Carl considered this for a long time, long enough that David thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Depends whether you walked away or got pushed. One of those is a decision. The other's just what happened to you." David turned that over in his mind for the rest of the day. He had a phone call with a former colleague named Michael, who had left Hart Industries voluntarily 2 years before David's termination and had gone on to build something of his own. a small supply chain consulting firm that had grown steadily and without drama into something Michael was genuinely proud of. Michael did not know the specifics of why David was calling. But he knew David, and he talked for a while about what it had felt like to leave a large institution and discover that the size of the institution had been doing more of the work than he had realized, and how it had taken him almost a year to trust his own competence again, in the absence of the structural validation that came with a big title and a corporate support system. David listened carefully. He did not ask any of them what he should do. Because he already knew the answer to that, the answer was always in him. It just took a while to become audible. What he was doing, he understood eventually, was testing the answer against the presence of other people, listening to hear whether it still sounded right when said into the world rather than just into his own head. On Saturday afternoon, he drove back to the garage. Changed the oil on a '68 Mustang he had been restoring for a customer across town, and thought about the difference between the life he had and the life he had left. They were not the same life. The garage was not a consolation prize for the career he had lost. It was a genuine thing, built by his own hands and worth what it was on its own terms. Going back to Hart Industries would not mean giving that up. It would mean choosing to do a thing his old life had taken from him. It would mean doing it now, on terms he controlled. The distinction was not academic. It was everything. He called Victoria on Sunday morning and told her to send him the full restructuring file. He was not making any promises. He needed to see the scope. She said she would send it within the hour. He said he would review it, and they could talk later in the week. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me yet." But there was something in his voice, something that had not been there during any of the previous conversations, that told her he had already decided. The Hart Industries Board of Directors met in a glass and steel conference room on the 23rd floor of the company's headquarters, and David Calloway walked into it for the first time in 3 years wearing a charcoal suit he had bought with money he had earned at the garage. And he was not nervous. He had been nervous, once, in rooms like this in the early years, when being in such rooms was new, and the approval of the people in them had seemed important. He was not nervous now because the approval of these particular people was not something he was seeking. He was there to present facts. The facts would speak for themselves, or they would not, and either way, he would walk back out. Victoria introduced him briefly, and the introduction was notable for what it did not include. It did not describe him as a returning employee, or a rehabilitation project, or a gesture of good faith. She introduced him as David Calloway, whose analysis of the company's operational architecture had informed the restructuring proposal the board was about to review. That was accurate and sufficient. He stood at the head of the table and presented, for 75 minutes, a granular and technically specific account of the operational changes required to execute the restructuring, drawing on his detailed knowledge of the company's systems and supplemented by the work he had done over the previous 10 days reviewing Victoria's files. He did not look at the board members who had been in the room the day he was fired. He did not look at them because they did not require his attention, the materials did. And the materials were thorough. At the 45th minute of the presentation, he set down the slide controller and told them he needed to address something that was not part of the restructuring proposal, but was relevant to the board's ability to make an informed decision. He then presented, briefly and without drama, a summary of the findings in Sandra Reeves's report, the evidence of Richard Marsh's fraud, the deliberate shaping of the original audit, the exclusion of key communications from the investigation file. He said the full documentation had been submitted to the company's legal counsel and to the relevant regulatory bodies that morning, and that the board should be aware this was a matter of public record, or would be shortly. 2 of the board members looked at each other. One of them said something to his lawyer. The room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the restructuring proposal and everything to do with exposure, accountability, and the specific discomfort of men who have been comfortable for a long time, being made to understand that the ground has changed. David picked up the slide controller and continued his presentation. The vote, when it came, was 5-3 in favor of the restructuring plan over the Meridian Capital acquisition. The 3 dissenting votes came from the board members most closely associated with the previous board culture. They resigned within 48 hours, citing personal reasons. Victoria accepted their resignations with a single line in the company press release and moved on. In the corridor outside the conference room afterward, she found David standing by the window, looking out at the city the way she had once been photographed, looking at it, except that his expression was entirely different. It was the expression of someone who is done with something and knows it, the clean, particular relief of a person who has finally put down a weight they have been carrying for a very long time. "You didn't have to do that," she said. She meant the Marsh disclosure. He had not told her he was going to include it in the presentation. "Yes, I did," he said simply. It was the truth. The board should know the truth. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him the question she had been holding since the night in the garage, the one she had not planned, the one that had come from somewhere outside her careful management of what she revealed about herself. "If the situation had been reversed," she said, "if you had been in my position 3 years ago, and I had been in yours, would you have believed me?" David considered this seriously, the way he considered things that deserved consideration. "I would have asked more questions," he said. "I would have given you more time." Victoria nodded. That was the right answer. That was, in fact, exactly the right answer, and she knew it. And the knowledge settled something in her that had been unsettled for a long time. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I know you know," he said. 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening that was clear and cold and smelled like the particular freshness that follows a week of rain, Victoria drove out to Millfield. It was not raining this time. She parked in the small lot beside the garage and sat for a moment before she got out, which was becoming a habit with her when it came to this particular address. David was still working when she arrived. She could see the light through the window, the dark shape of him moving around a vehicle. She knocked. He opened the door. He was less surprised this time, and the look on his face was not the shut, guarded expression of their first encounter, but something more relaxed, which was not the same as easy but was at least honest. They walked to the diner at the end of the street, the same all-night place she had bought coffee from on that second evening, and they sat in a booth by the window and talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with restructuring proposals or board votes or legal filings. He told her about the '68 Mustang restoration. She told him about a hiking trip she had taken 5 years ago and never told anyone about because it seemed like the kind of thing that didn't fit the image she was cultivating at the time. He laughed a real laugh, the first one she had heard from him at something she said about getting genuinely lost in the rain for 6 hours on a trail in Vermont. And she sat across from him in the booth and thought, with a clarity that was almost startling, that this person, right here in this ordinary diner in this ordinary town, was one of the most honest people she had ever been in a room with. The formal arrangement had been drafted and signed the week before. David Calloway was not returning to Hart Industries as an employee. He was not the chief operating officer. He was a strategic partner, an external consultant with a defined scope, a defined engagement period, and a contract that reflected the value of his contribution without asking him to surrender any part of the independence he had built. He kept the garage. He hired a part-time mechanic to cover the days when he needed to be in the city, and he worked 3 days a week at the company's headquarters and drove back to Millfield in the evenings. It was not the arrangement anyone who had known either of them 3 years ago would have predicted. And that was, in some way, precisely the point. Victoria had come back to the subject of that sentence twice now, the one David had said in the garage on the first night, the one that had stopped her like a physical force. "People like you only remember other people when you need something from them." She had been thinking about it, she told him. Not because it had stung, though it had, but because it had been, in that moment, the truest thing anyone had said to her in years, and she had been trying to understand why. She thought it was because most of the people in her life responded to who she appeared to be rather than who she actually was, and that she had spent so long curating the appearance that she had almost forgotten there was a difference. He had spoken to the person underneath the appearance without even knowing she was there. "You said it without thinking," she told him. "That's why it worked." David shook his head. "I said it because I'd been thinking it for 3 years," he told her. "It just found its moment." Victoria laughed a real laugh. something she did even less frequently than he did. "Fair enough," she said. On the last night of October, almost 4 weeks after the board meeting, Victoria was sitting in her office, going through a set of quarterly projections when her phone lit up with a message from David. It said, "The Mustang runs. Thought you should know." She stared at it for a moment. Then she put the projections aside, sent back a single line. "What does that mean for the paint job?" And waited. His reply came fast. "Nothing good. The paint job is a separate problem." She set the phone down and found that she was smiling, which was something she had once been very careful not to do in that office. She let herself do it anyway. There is a version of the story of David Calloway and Victoria Hart that ends with a grand gesture, a formal reconciliation, a moment of restored dignity that resolves every wrong into something clean and satisfying. That version is easier to tell but less true. The truth was more patient, more incremental, built out of smaller materials, an honest conversation in a garage, a folder of evidence laid without ceremony on a workbench, a board presentation that said the thing that needed saying, a booth in a diner at the end of a street, in a town where nobody knew anybody's net worth. The truth was that forgiveness is not an event. It is a decision made repeatedly, in small ways, over time. And what makes it possible is not the erasure of what happened, but the refusal to let what happened remain the most important thing in the room. David Calloway had not forgiven Victoria Hart the night she stood in the rain and said she was sorry. He had not forgiven her the night she came back with coffee and told him the full truth of what she needed. He had not even fully forgiven her the day he walked into the board meeting and said the things that needed to be said. Forgiveness had happened in the space between those moments, in the quiet accumulation of evidence that the person who had wronged him was not the same person she had been, and that he was not the same person he had been, and that holding the past in front of both of them like a shield was costing them something they had not agreed to pay. He had not forgotten what had happened. He was not required to. He had simply decided, at some point, that he could not precisely locate. To stop letting it hold the most important chair in his life. The garage was still his. The apartment above it was still his. The '68 Mustang deep red under the new coat, just as the owner had wanted, had driven out of the lot under its own power on a Tuesday morning, and David had watched it go with the particular satisfaction that belongs entirely to the people who fix things, who understand what a broken object is underneath its breaking, who know how to listen to what something needs and provide exactly that and not one thing more. He had thought, watching those taillights disappear around the corner, that the car had nothing to do with Hart Industries, with the board vote, with Victoria, or Marsh, or any of it. It was simply a thing that had needed fixing, and he had fixed it. And it ran. There was a cleanness to that which no corporate title had ever quite given him, and he recognized it for what it was, the specific satisfaction of work done without politics, without performance, without anyone else's judgment attached to the outcome. That satisfaction was his. It did not belong to Hart Industries, and it did not belong to any version of the life he had lost and recovered. It belonged to him. He carried it with him when he drove to the city. And he carried it back when he drove home. It was, if he was honest, the best thing he owned. Sometimes the person who knocks on your door at midnight is not there to ask you for something. Sometimes they are carrying the thing you lost and have been looking for the proof that you were right. The acknowledgement that you deserved, the simple human recognition that you were treated unfairly and that someone with the power to say so is finally saying it. And sometimes what that does is not give you your old life back. What it does is hand you the key to the next one, the one where you are no longer defined by what was taken from you, no longer measured against a version of yourself that was built inside someone else's crisis. What the person at the door hands you, if you are willing to take it, is not a second chance from them. It is a second chance with yourself, and that, in the end, is the only second chance that ever really mattered.